the newsagents.
I have known Prime Minister Netanyahu for a very long time. While we have vehemently disagreed on many occasions, I believe in his heart his highest priority is the security of Israel. However, I also believe Prime Minister Netanyahu has lost his way. He has put himself in coalition with far-right extremists, and as a result, he has been too willing to tolerate the civilian toll in Gaza. As a lifelong supporter of Israel, it has become clear to me the Netanyahu coalition no longer fits the needs of Israel after October 7th. At this critical juncture, I believe a new election is the only way to allow for a healthy and open decision-making process about the future of Israel.
That was Chuck Schumer, the Democrat Senate Majority Leader and most senior Jewish politician in the United States, speaking on the floor of the Senate on Thursday. It was a remarkable intervention, which shocked Washington and doubtless Jerusalem too. He said he'd known Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for 20 years, that he respected him, that he didn't doubt his patriotism, but also that he had to go, for his country's sake, for the region's sake, to finally end this bloody darkness which has gripped Gaza and Israel since October the 7th. On today's show, we ask whether Washington is, after a very long time, about to move against Bibi. Welcome to the Newsagents. Right, before we get on to Schumer, just to say we have got quite the interview coming up with Sayeeda Warsi. She used to be the chair of the Conservative Party, Britain's first Muslim cabinet minister. Boy, has she got some strong words for her former colleagues who are now around the cabinet table. The word arsonists may or may not come up. But first, Chuck Schumer, as promised. And it's just worth listening, actually, to the full 2 minutes or so where he is addressing Netanyahu on the Senate floor. I don't think the Senate has ever quite heard something like this.
I have known Prime Minister Netanyahu for a very long time. While we have vehemently disagreed on many occasions, I will always respect his extraordinary bravery for Israel on the battlefield as a younger man. I believe in his heart his highest priority is the security of Israel. However, I also believe Prime Minister Netanyahu has lost his way by allowing his political survival to take the precedence over the best interests of Israel. He has put himself in coalition with far-right extremists like Ministers Smotrich and Ben Gvir, and as a result, he has been too willing to tolerate the civilian toll in Gaza, which is pushing support for Israel worldwide to historic lows. Israel cannot survive if it becomes a pariah. As a lifelong supporter of Israel, it has become clear to me the Netanyahu coalition no longer fits the needs of Israel after October 7th. The world has changed radically since then, and the Israeli people are being stifled right now by a governing vision that is stuck in the past. At this critical juncture, I believe a new election is the only way to allow for a healthy and open decision-making process about the future of Israel, at a time when so many Israelis have lost their confidence in the vision and direction of their government. Hamas and the Palestinians who support and tolerate their evil ways, radical right-wing Israelis in government and society, President Abbas, Prime Minister Netanyahu. These are the four obstacles to peace, and if we fail to overcome them, then Israel and the West Bank and Gaza will be trapped in the same violent state of affairs they've experienced for the last 75 years.
Blistering stuff from Schumer, who again is the most senior Jewish political figure in America right now, to talk about all of this, not least because he has a column, I'm told, about it in this week's Independent, or the Independent Online, I should say, our very own John Sopel. making yet another Friday appearance. Honestly, Linda, your wife, she really doesn't want you around the house, does she?
Well, one, she doesn't, but Lewis, you can't live without me.
I can't.
So I'm here for the third
I've got
Friday
Stockholm syndrome,
in a row,
John.
And I can't believe I'm still stuck in this studio looking at you.
Oh, says the man who, when we said, do you want to send a voice note, says, oh, I'll just come in. Yeah, all right, whatever. This was an amazing moment, wasn't it, really?
Yes, it really was. And what makes it more amazing is that Chuck Schumer has been in the Senate for 25 years. He and Joe Biden are very close. Chuck Schumer, the senator for New York, Biden was the senator for Delaware. They know each other well. I just do not believe that Schumer would have done that without the White House being aware of what it was that he was saying. And if you just chart a timeline over the past sort of 10 days or so, it really is quite revealing the extent to which relations have soured between Netanyahu and the White House and the US administration. Because 10 days ago, you had the kind of, just before the State of the Union, you had Biden saying Rafah was a red line. At the State of the Union, Biden is heard on a hot mic talking to another senator saying, me and Netanyahu are going to have a come to Jesus moment. In other words, we're going to have serious words. And when it was pointed out to Biden that it had been caught, he said, good. And then on Monday, and I think that, and I think this is extraordinary. There are various intelligence departments within the US, the CIA, the most famous, but there's also the Director of National Intelligence. They put out an unclassified report saying the public's lack of confidence in Netanyahu's ability to govern has deepened and expanded even more than before the war. We're witnessing large protests. Now, to put that out publicly without any classification, that's not a leak. The DNI put that out in plain sight. And then you got what Chuck Schumer said yesterday. It all feels to me as part of a piece.
And even more than just saying that, like, he's a problem, or even more than just saying there needs to be some shift in Israeli policy. It was the specific linking, I thought, that he made, which many people have made, but to hear him make it, such a senior American political figure, tying together the war and Netanyahu's own domestic political prospects, basically saying, actually, it's in Netanyahu's interest for the war to continue for as long as possible because of all of the kind of domestic, legal, political problems that he's facing. That, to me, was extraordinary.
Yes, and he didn't need to do it.
No.
And it was shocking. And I think it will have shocked Israelis. And just to go into the mindset of so many Israelis. Look, overwhelmingly, there is still support for what the Israeli armed forces are trying to do, which is to destroy Hamas after October the 7th. But the idea that there could be this hemorrhaging or a breach in the support for Israel from the United States. I set out that timeline. I think we're only 2 steps or 3 steps away from Biden disowning Netanyahu. That would be an unbelievable moment, because since the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948, the one thing that Israel has always been able to rely on is the strong support of the United States of America, whoever is the president. And the fact that relations are cooling to such an extent will send a shiver down the spine of many Israelis. And so in Israeli public opinion, you've got sort of 2 contradictory things at work. On the one hand, support for Netanyahu low, but support for the campaign to get rid of Hamas very high still indeed, even if that means a land incursion into Rafah with all the consequences that could flow from that.
That feels to me, right, like that's the crucial inflection point now, right? And Blinken's been saying this, right, the Secretary of State, is like, if they actually go into Rafah without the requisite and necessary humanitarian precautions, whatever they might be, and it's impossible, hard to see actually what they could be.
Well, how do you move 1 million people like that?
Then surely that is the sort of inflection point for continued American support. But I suppose the question, I'm not sure I know the answer to this yet, maybe we can't know yet, is to what extent is this about actually the prospect of, like, the White House, the American state, the Pentagon and so on, actually potentially withdrawing or starting to withdraw not just political support but military support to Israel? Or is it more about Democrat political considerations, in the sense they know how damaging this is proving, particularly in states like Michigan with, big Muslim American populations, how damaging the war is to the potential re-election of Biden himself?
It all overlaps.
Yeah.
To try and draw a neat distinction between those things is virtually impossible, because when we were there in the last few days, I heard Democrats saying, well, of course, I mean, what's happening now is that Netanyahu is helping Trump. Because, the longer this goes on, the more unpopular Biden becomes. And they are pally. And the more this goes on, the more it helps Donald Trump, because Joe Biden loses support on college campuses, among young people, among Arab Americans. I just think that's a ridiculously myopic view. I think Benjamin Netanyahu has got enough problems of his own at the moment in Israel, and what the hell happens there for him to be kind of putting a thumb on the scale of the US presidential election. But you can see how everything overlaps, and that there is no neat distinctions, and that Netanyahu is worried about his domestic political position. Biden is worried about his domestic political position. Both will have elections soon enough. Both have got difficult things to weigh. Biden under immense pressure from young people and from Arab Americans and from progressive Democrats. Netanyahu under immense pressure for the abject intelligence failures that lead to October the 7th. And you can see that when politicians are fighting for their lives and for their futures, all sorts of other decisions get compromised.
Can you imagine a world where Biden actually said and called on Bibi to go himself?
Well,
because it's only one step away, right?
2 weeks ago, I'd have said, absolutely not, you must be joking, Lewis. Having seen what has just happened in the last 10 days, I think, not impossible, still on the very unlikely end of the scale. It looks like Biden is using other proxies to deliver a message as a final kind of warning shot, to crank up the pressure on Netanyahu, to see the direction of travel. Because ultimately, the end point of the direction of travel, if you just take what Schumer has said, what the Director of National Intelligence has said, what Biden was heard saying at the State of the Union, it leads in one direction. And that is, Netanyahu, it's time for you to go. For an American president to say that of an elected, freely elected, democratically, you are calling for regime change in a country that is a functioning democracy.
Yeah.
That would be an exceptional moment, but one that was, as I say, would terrify Israelis, because if you can't count on America, who can Israel count on?
There's one other thing, right? And you can hear it, and it's not the most important thing given the gravity of the situation, but it is interesting, right? When you could hear it in what Schumer was saying, and everything you read about Biden, and also hearing how he talks about him, it is the personal relationship between Netanyahu and these players, right? Because he's been around for so long, like a player on Israeli politics for so long. And obviously, Israeli-US connections, what they are. He's always in Washington. They're always in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or wherever. And they have this complicated relationship, right? Like Biden's relationship with him personally in particular. I mean, everything that he's apparently said about him, which is like equivalent of, Bibi, do my head in, you're constantly, yanking my chain, but I love you. There's this kind of odd dynamic and relationship that he does have with them.
There is a very senior US politician who was a CIA officer at the time of George H.W. Bush, so the Bush 41, not George W. Bush, who took over and led the invasion of Iraq in 2003 with Tony Blair at his side. But this CIA officer met Netanyahu the first time he came and was going to go into the White House. And he wrote to George H.W. Bush and said, this man should not be allowed onto the premises of the White House grounds. He is untrustworthy, he is difficult, he is awkward, and I think more trouble will come from meeting him than not meeting him. That was the view of the CIA all those years ago. Yeah. And nothing has changed. He's had a difficult relationship with every American president ever since. I mean, really difficult. Obama had an appalling relationship with Netanyahu. George W. Bush had a difficult relationship. It goes right the way back. Everyone has had a difficult relationship except Donald Trump. Those two really liked each other, although Netanyahu did, straight after the 2020 election, congratulate Biden, and Trump thought that was a betrayal. And you wonder whether there is an element in which Netanyahu is trying to get back into Trump's good graces for some future date when Trump is back in the White House and Bibi still somehow is clinging on as the Prime Minister of Israel.
Thanks for dropping by. See you next week.
Bye.
Well, it has been another extraordinary week in Westminster. I suppose if you keep saying that, then it loses all meaning, but it has felt quite something when we've ended up spending half the week talking about whether or not a man who said that a particular black woman made him dislike all black women, having an argument about whether that statement is racist or not, or at least the Prime Minister at least not accepting initially that it was racist. But you can obviously tell a longer story about what has happened to the Conservative Party and its views on racism and race relations. And it's easy to forget that 10, 15 years ago, David Cameron was leader of the Conservative Party, and he made it one of his missions to detoxify, so-called, the Conservative Party, particularly with ethnic minority communities. And the woman who was, in a way, central to that was Sayeeda Warsi, who became a Conservative baroness. She'd been a parliamentary candidate before in Dewsbury, and she became a Conservative member of the Lords and party chairwoman. And she joins us now. Sayeeda, thanks so much for coming on the show. She's also, by the way, I should say, got a new podcast herself called A Muslim and a Jew Go There, hosted with David Baddiel. We're going to talk about that. But Sayeeda, how are you feeling after the events of this week? Have you sort of managed to make sense of them in your head?
I have. And, it probably surprises you when I say this, Lewis, but there is some positive to all of this. And I'll tell you why. Because if you go back to 2016, so about 8 years ago now, when I first started raising these issues with the party, my concerns around what was at that time the kind of low-level racism that we were seeing amongst some of our supporters, our members online, in associations, it simply wasn't taken seriously. And I think definitely post David Cameron, it was just poo-pooed that we didn't have an issue. And I think because some of our leaders, particularly people like Boris, who'd made comments in the past, I think they weren't ready to face up to some of these comments and the fact that they may have been part and parcel of the problem. And so now, 8 years on, having documented much of this, and some sections of the media did cover it, and the fact that hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases have been presented before the Conservative Party, from members of parliament to even actually ministers, inappropriately saying things online, liking things online, tweeting things online, being associated with people who had a checkered history on racism and the comments that they were making. It finally seems to be that this is now in the public consciousness. And so I think it is probably far worse now, although there was a time when almost there was a case on a daily basis. So we have been in this kind of a period before. But I think what makes this period particularly bad is just how awful the individual comments are, just how high profile these individual comments are. So the members of parliament, they're big donors, they're ex-prime ministers like Liz Truss. But the fact that the Prime Minister finds it incredibly difficult just to call it out. So we were here a couple of weeks ago with Lee Anderson, with his Islamophobic comments, his anti-Muslim racist comments, and the Prime Minister just couldn't bring himself to use the word anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia. He called it wrongism, and I think this week it's been inappropriateism. We just cannot seem to find the words to say what this is.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think that is so? Because for so many people, particularly this week, and with Lee Anderson as well, I was talking to Gavin Barwell, of course, former Chief of Staff to Theresa May, and he was saying this is an open and shut case, just like it was with Lee Anderson. So a lot of people are looking at it going, if you can't judge an open and shut case, why is that for Sunak?
Yeah. And Gavin and I are both of that era when, I remember campaigning with Gavin in Croydon, where we're from an era where we genuinely thought the Conservative Party was embracing and encompassing of all of Britain's in all its diversity. And in some ways, we have been successful within the Conservative Party because we are the most diverse kind of parliamentary party and front bench that Britain has ever seen. But it seems like diversity is only skin deep, and that somehow behind all of that still lies this very terrible racism, which we find difficult to call out. Now, there could be a number of reasons for this, right? It could be that we're in the middle of an election year and the Prime Minister simply does not want to admit that anything in the party is wrong because it may impact his electoral chances. It could be that because of his own heritage, he finds it harder to deal with these issues because he just doesn't want to draw attention to the fact that he takes these issues very seriously. Because look, there have been women in public life at the highest level who don't want to talk about women's issues because they think somehow they don't want to be pigeonholed in that way. So whether he finds it difficult to talk about these issues because of his own racial background, or it could just be that he himself doesn't take these things very seriously. It wasn't just a racist comment, it was a violent racist comment. He basically said, somebody needs to shoot her or she needs to be shot. This is the kind of career-ending thing which in the past, it didn't matter which political party you were in, would have been the end of any of your association in politics. And the fact that my colleagues have said, well, he's apologised and we're not really sure whether he has apologised or how he's apologised. It's not entirely clear how much money was taken or whether money is still being taken. It's just a terrible thing to watch. And I realise that this is going to stick with us, unfortunately, for a very long time. It's what Theresa would call, as Gavin would well know, it's what Theresa would call the nasty party, and it stuck with us for a very long time.
So do you think
it took us a long time.
Do you think it will retoxify the Conservative Party with ethnic minority voters?
It's not just ethnic minority voters. So if you look at what David Cameron did with equal marriage, he didn't just appeal as a result of that to people from LGBTQ communities. He appealed to wider liberal Britain who thought, oh, okay, this is a party that now understands what the country has become and is much more of an inclusive party. So I don't think it's just ethnic minority parties who look across at us and think, we really don't like these really distasteful racist comments. I think it's just general Brits who just feel very uncomfortable about this kind of thing coming out of a political party, and a prime minister who's finding it incredibly difficult to lead, which is what his job is to do.
So I'm gonna sort of press you again, Sayeeda, because I'm also trying to sort of work this out, because I'm not entirely certain what the answer is either. Like, we've got a paradox, haven't we? Because you already alluded to it. We've actually got the most diverse cabinet in history. They, to some extent, are following in your footsteps. You were the first Muslim cabinet minister. We've got a country which actually, according to all of the polls, has become more liberal and actually in so many ways more at ease with itself. And yet at the top of politics and the Conservative Party, which has given us that most diverse cabinet, etc., you've already said it. There are comments now which would once have been career-ending, which aren't. There are comments which are made which would once have had no debate, which now have endless debate. And it feels as if actually more extreme views are becoming more commonplace, not less commonplace. So why is that?
When I sat at the cabinet table for the first time in 2010, I was the only non-white member of that cabinet, and I was chairman of the Conservative Party. And these comments and this level of racism simply did not exist. The message from the top very clearly, both from my office at the chairman's office and the Prime Minister with David Cameron, was, we're not going to tolerate this. So it's really shocking now that we have far more diversity. So clearly we're sending out some signals, whether it's the kind of rhetoric that comes out of people like Suella Braverman, or the kind of stuff that we've heard from Liz Truss sharing a platform with Steve Bannon, and who sat there praising Tommy Robinson, or whether it's the fact that the Prime Minister just can't use words like anti-Muslim racism or Islamophobia or racism. We're clearly sending out these subliminal messages that somehow it's okay to be like this within the party and get away with it. And then yesterday, Michael Gove, who's just launched something on extremism, very odd kind of announcement, which I'm sure we'll come to, who is asked about these extremist views where somebody hates all black women and is criticizing a black woman and is asking for her to be shot. When asked whether these are extreme views, which in any category in anybody's book would be an extreme view, says, well, he's apologized, so I believe in Christian forgiveness, so let's all move on. I mean, what does that even mean? In the past, if somebody said, no, let's just have Muslim forgiveness or Jewish forgiveness or Christian forgiveness, and let's just move on from it, the country would have been flabbergasted that that's the way things are done. In any other workplace, can you imagine, Lewis, somebody being racist and HR saying, that's fine, he's apologised, we believe in Christian forgiveness, let's all move on? The courts would have a field day with you. They would have you. The way in which you would be treated by a tribunal as an employer is just, clear for everybody to see. And the fact that we believe that those rules don't apply to us is shocking.
What did you make more widely of Gove's proposals yesterday?
So I'm not surprised by Michael Gove's announcement. He talked about these back in a book or a policy paper for Policy Exchange, I think in 2009. He's always wanted to bring in these very authoritarian rules and regulations. He has a very interesting ideology in which he has a very odd view of the world. And he also has a very specific view of the Middle East. You only have to read his previous readings. I mean, he thought that the Oslo Accord was an appeasement of the Palestinian people. I mean, he fundamentally found it very, very difficult. I think on LBC, actually, when Tom Swarbrick was interviewing him, I think he found it very difficult just to agree with the government lines of Gaza is an occupied place and Israel is an occupying power, and he believes in a two-state solution. I mean, Tom really had to drag that out of him.
The UK law recognises Gaza is occupied. Is UK law wrong?
No, I think UK law is right, but I think it's important also when we're dealing with these inevitably sensitive questions to recognise that
So Gaza is occupied by Israel?
Well, at the moment, it is the case that there is a terrible conflict going on there that followed on from the slaughter of...
what it is the British government thinks about what is going on in Gaza. Gaza is occupied by Israel, isn't it?
Well, at the moment, an horrific conflict is going on there. Israel, understandably, wants to ensure that Hamas no longer poses a threat after the events of October the 7th, but it is also the case that we need to ensure that the Palestinian people get the aid that they need.
Does Michael Gove recognise that Gaza is occupied by Israel?
Well, I recognise the vital importance of the British government speaking with one voice on foreign policy. We have an excellent Foreign Secretary in David Cameron, and I support everything that he says and does.
It's not quite a yes. OK. What is going
It is a yes.
It is a yes. Good.
But?
But?
No buts. It is a yes.
So I think you need to understand the person that you're dealing with when you look at this announcement, and this deeply goes to Michael's ideological view of the world. And it's Michael, I think, unfortunately, flying his kite at the back end of a Conservative government in its dying days with a Prime Minister who is incredibly weak. I think it's dangerous and divisive policy making. I think he's trying to poison the well for a future Labour, potentially what looks like a future Labour government. And I just hope Labour have the confidence to basically give it short shrift if they were to become the next government.
So would you say then that your view is, or you could argue that Michael Gove, the guy who's writing the extremism legislation, at least in some areas on this, has some rather extreme views, let's not say extremist, but extreme views on some of these matters himself historically?
Oh, there's no doubt in my mind on that, and I've written about it in my book, The Enemy Within. I sat around the table with Michael and had deep concerns about his views, as did other colleagues as well. And of course, let's not forget the kind of people that he's mixed with in the past, from Trump to Bannon and others, right? The company that he keeps is really quite worrying, and the views that he holds is really quite worrying. So he should be nowhere near this, and he should be nowhere near foreign policy. I think he has some really good views on housing and maybe local government reform, but anything kind of more serious and anywhere near national security, I genuinely don't think it's in Britain's best interest for him to be anywhere near that policy making.
So did you think it's clear that the Conservative Party, or the top of the Conservative Party anyway, right now, has a hierarchy of racism, in the sense that, I mean, if Hester had said what he'd said about a Jewish politician, it feels to me impossible that we'd have had the same conversation that we'd had this week.
David Baddiel and I talk about this a lot on our podcast. Well, when the whole point of this podcast, a Muslim and a Jew go there, was about going there, having those difficult conversations that most people are wanting to avoid. And David often talks about this concept of the hierarchy of racism and how Jews are seen as white, and that we don't see the racism that they face in the way that we see maybe people of colour. But I think one of the most powerful things that I've heard in recent times is from Robert Peston himself, from the Jewish community, who talks about replacing, he said, every one of these comments that we hear in the public space, if we were to replace the word, Jew with Muslim, if we were to replace the word Islamist with Zionist, if we were to, and he said, nobody would hesitate 1 minute to say this is unacceptable and this is racism. And I just think that that is a very good stress test, for us. Replace what is being said by another community and see, and not just the Jewish community, replace it by Black, replace it by Muslim, replace it by Jewish. How would we feel that those comments would be taken? There is no doubt these comments are racist, and there is no doubt that the Conservative Party should give this money back. You don't build, I see it as toxic money now. It is kind of dirty money that we've now received from a source which I think has views which should not take place in public life.
Well,
and therefore, elections that are built on the back of that kind of money, I don't think make for good electioneering.
Well, you've gone further, haven't you? You've said that elections fought on the money of donors who make racist and offensive statements make for dangerous election campaigns. What do you mean by that? Do you think that there's a danger of violence?
No, I don't think it's violence, but for our country to be divided, for there to be a sense of unease, for there to be friction between communities, that in my world is dangerous. National security absolutely depends on national cohesion. And when we start to say things in politics, and when money like this starts to enter politics, then we start to break down those bonds between communities, and it is dangerous. Because the minute cohesion breaks down, everything else becomes far more difficult to manage.
You must have thought, Sayeeda, about your party membership, given everything you've said. Are you going to stick with the Conservative Party?
I'm going to try and bring back a Conservative Party, because the current Tory party is not the Conservative Party. The one thing that I campaigned in the north of England when Conservatives were not particularly popular, you would often get shouted at and your door slammed in your face. I still live in an old mining village. And so in many ways, this was hard territory for us to be out campaigning in. But the two things that you could always stand on, irrespective of whatever people thought of you as Conservatives, is that we were, one, the party of clear patriotism, where you were loyal to your country and you did everything you could to make that country work and keep everybody safe. And I don't think that many of my colleagues are patriots now. I think I classify them as arsonists. I think they use language and bring policy forward which sets fires in our nation. So I do worry about it. When we start questioning the rule of law, when we start breaking international agreements, when we start talking about judges as the enemies of the state, when we start to make the crazy financial decisions that were made under Liz Truss, we're not the party of sound money, and we're not the party of patriotism anymore. And those things were always what the Conservative Party was, and I don't see some of the current set of colleagues showing those values.
So you're staying to fight. Finally, tell everybody again when they can listen to your great new podcast, and you enjoying the podcasting world with David Baddiel.
I am, actually. It's my first podcast, so I've not been
it won't
part
be the
of
last, I'm sure.
World. It's my first podcasting entry into the podcasting world. David and I have worked together before. We worked on a program called Stand Up to Cancer, Stand Up and Deliver, where he as a comedian was teaching novices like me the art of stand-up. We weren't paired together, but we worked together on the program. And he's such great fun and obviously understands issues around anti-Semitism deeply, such a clearly recognisable Jew. I understand the issues of Islamophobia deeply. I've worked on it for decades. Obviously recognisable Muslim. And so we really go there, Lewis. In some of the conversations, there are a few, as I call, squeaky bum moments, where it does get quite heated and quite tense. Yeah. Exactly. And in fact, this week I was fasting. It's the month of Ramadan.
Of course.
And halfway through one of these conversations, it was getting so kind of tense that I reached over and just had a big glug of water. And I went, well, there you go. There's my Ramadan gone. But I think because underlying it all is kindness and compassion and fun and friendship, it allows
everything the news agents doesn't have.
I'm sure it does, and more, but I'm really grateful for you letting me talk about my podcast on your podcast.
Not at all. It's been our pleasure. Sayeeda Warsi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
There is something which links the stories we've discussed today, and it addresses that question, which is the question, the troubling question. How have we become accustomed to the slow, steady drumbeat of death in Gaza, of starvation, of humanitarian terror? There's loads of geopolitics, there's loads of complicated history of politics generally, of the inevitable consequences of the appalling events of October the 7th. It is complex. But part of the answer has to be we've become used to these brown faces dying in this region where over decades we've become used to these brown faces dying. And maybe the fact that they are brown, that if they weren't, maybe we in the West might have a different attitude, or that we might, just might, see it differently, that our societies, even in geopolitics, on some level, have a hierarchy of race too, conscious or subconscious, and if they were white, if it was in Europe, as with, say, the Serbs, or indeed Ukrainians, would we care more? Would we have done more? If the conflict wasn't bound up in ancient questions and enmities around Muslims, would we do more? Is there something about the weeping woman in the headscarf on the TV which makes us turn away, or makes us care a little bit less? Would our politics be responding differently if it were a different group of people in a different conflict? I don't know, and maybe it's a stupid question, because it is this conflict, and this conflict is unique and has its own inevitable set of consequences which flow from every action and reaction, and you can't unpick any particular strand of the tapestry. But I still think it's still worth our asking ourselves, and for us to have an honest conversation about what we find. Well, that is it for this week. Remember, you can catch up on all our shows from the week on Global Player and send us story tips and feedback to newsagents@global.com. Thanks to our production team on the News Agents, Awal Gabriel Radis and Laura Fitzpatrick, Georgia Foxwell, Alex Barnett, Rory Simon, Shane Fenley and Arvin Badawal. Our editor is Tom Hughes. It's presented by Emily Maitlis, John Sopel and me, Lewis Goodall. And sorry, I did mean to say sorry that John had to rush away. Third Friday in a row that he's done. Well done to him. And he was straight off with a Today programme racing selections guru Rob Bonnet to spend his extra show fee for the day at the Gold Cup in Cheltenham. Please, John, gamble responsibly. And as soon as that's done, Emily, John and I are off to make a few extra rubles of our own via our temporary employers at the All-Russian State Television and Radio Broadcasting Company, or VGTRK. Yes, that's right, in a way which is sure to match the result, i.e. by no popular demand whatsoever, we're going to be presenting Russian election night over the weekend. And the good news is we've been able to rehearse the results in advance ever since the last one. So the production, unlike this one on a day-to-day basis, should be completely seamless. Long live the motherland, or Zdravstvujet Rodina. Goodbye. See you Monday.
The News Agents. This is a Global Player original podcast.